Most people who have spent any part of their lives inside a church recognize the name Melchizedek. They may have heard it in a sermon, encountered it in the letter to the Hebrews, or listened as a priest pronounced it over bread and wine. Yet recognition is not understanding. Ask who Melchizedek was, where he came from, which people he belonged to, or what deity he served, and the certainty usually disappears. A name repeated for centuries remains surrounded by silence. That silence is often presented as sacred mystery, but mystery and absence are not the same thing. A mystery invites investigation. An absence may reveal that something was forgotten, suppressed, reinterpreted, or never known in the first place. Spinoza understood this distinction with unusual clarity. He insisted that sacred texts must be examined as texts, through language, context, authorship, history, and the intentions of those who transmitted them. Reverence cannot substitute for evidence. Tradition cannot transform an assumption into a fact merely by repeating it for enough centuries. So before asking what Melchizedek means to Christianity, we must begin with a more basic question. What does the earliest text actually tell us? The answer is almost nothing. Melchizedek appears suddenly in Genesis 14. Abram has returned from battle after rescuing Lot and recovering stolen goods. Kings are gathering around him. Then, without introduction, Melchizedek enters the scene. He is described as king of Salem and priest of Elyon, God Most High. He brings bread and wine, blesses Abram, and receives a tenth of the recovered wealth. Then he disappears. No childhood is recorded. No family is named. No tribe claims him. No explanation is given for his authority. The text does not tell us when he became king, how he became a priest, what traditions shaped his ritual, or what happened to him afterward. He enters the narrative fully formed, performs a ceremony of enormous significance, and vanishes after 3 verses. This would be strange in any ancient narrative. In Genesis, it is extraordinary. Genesis is preoccupied with ancestry. Its stories move through fathers, sons, brothers, wives, descendants, inheritances, and rival bloodlines. Genealogy is not decorative information. It establishes identity, legitimacy, land rights, covenantal status, and political authority. The text repeatedly tells us who descended from whom, because lineage determines where a person stands in the sacred order. Yet the first person explicitly called a priest in the biblical narrative has no recorded lineage at all. More importantly, this priest appears to stand above Abram. In the symbolic world of the story, the one who gives the blessing possesses superior religious authority. The one who receives a tenth acknowledges that authority. Abram, the future patriarch of Israel, accepts both the blessing and the hierarchy implied by it. He does not challenge Melchizedek. He does not correct his theology. He does not ask him to invoke another divine name. He participates in the encounter as though the priest's status requires no explanation. That should disturb the simplicity of the story many people inherited. Who was this man whom Abram recognized without hesitation? Why did a priest outside Abram's known household possess enough authority to bless him? Why did Abram give him a tenth? And why does a book obsessed with ancestry refuse to identify his ancestry? The conventional response is that the silence itself makes Melchizedek mysterious. But this explanation merely renames the problem. It does not solve it. To call an absence mystery can become a way of protecting it from examination. The very next movement of Genesis turns toward Abram's descendants. Questions of inheritance, promised children, future generations, and bloodline become central. The narrative knows how to discuss genealogy when genealogy matters. It discusses it constantly. That makes the absence surrounding Melchizedek more conspicuous, not less. Perhaps the original tradition never preserved his ancestry. Perhaps an editor considered it irrelevant. Perhaps material once associated with him disappeared during transmission. We cannot prove which explanation is correct merely from the silence. And this is precisely the point Spinoza would force us to confront. The text's failure to provide information does not authorize us to invent certainty. A blank space is not evidence for whatever theology later readers need it to contain. But the missing genealogy is only the first problem. Consider the objects Melchizedek carries. Bread and wine appear so familiar to Christian readers that they seem almost destined to belong in the scene. Centuries of Eucharistic interpretation have trained the eye to see them as anticipations of Christian ritual. But Abram did not live inside later Christian symbolism. Melchizedek was not celebrating a medieval mass. The scene belongs to the ritual world of the ancient Near East. Food and drink offered by a priest could mark hospitality, political recognition, covenantal fellowship, or sacred alliance. These were not merely refreshments for a tired warrior. Within the narrative, they accompany a blessing, a divine invocation, and the transfer of a tenth. The elements belong to a structured religious encounter. Abram does not merely meet Melchizedek. He enters a ritual relationship with him. This raises a question that later theology often avoids. Into whose religious framework does Abram step? The deity named in the blessing is not introduced with the personal name Yahweh. Melchizedek is called a priest of El Elyon. He blesses Abram in the name of El Elyon, possessor or creator of heaven and earth. He praises El Elyon for delivering Abram's enemies into his hands. Most modern readers encounter the expression God Most High and assume it is simply another title for the God they already know. The translation makes the phrase sound generic, universal, and comfortably monotheistic, but the ancient language is less comfortable. El Elyon carries a history. To understand Melchizedek, we must therefore step outside the theological world constructed by later Christianity and return to the religious environment in which these names first circulated. We must ask what El and Elyon meant before generations of interpreters harmonized them with Yahweh. That investigation does not begin in a church. It begins in the religious landscape of ancient Canaan, among peoples Israelite tradition would later describe as outsiders, rivals, and idolaters. And this is where the story becomes far more unsettling. The expression translated as God Most High appears harmless because translation has already performed an act of interpretation. It gives the modern reader a theological conclusion before the historical question has even been asked. The Hebrew expression is El Elyon. El can function as a general word for deity. But in the religious traditions of ancient Syria and Canaan, El was also the name of a particular high god. He was portrayed as an aged divine ruler, father of gods, head of a heavenly assembly, and source of authority within the pantheon. This was not a marginal figure known only through speculation. Archaeological discoveries at Ugarit, on the Syrian coast, revealed a substantial collection of late Bronze Age texts describing the religious world of the region. In these texts, El presides over a divine household. Other gods act within an ordered council. Asherah appears in relation to him. Divine sons receive functions, territories, and authority. The discovery of these texts changed biblical studies because they provided direct evidence of the wider cultural environment in which many biblical names, images, and poetic structures developed. This does not mean that every biblical use of the word El refers without distinction to the Ugaritic deity. Language evolves. Titles are transferred. Gods can be identified with one another, redefined, subordinated, or absorbed as religious communities change. But it does mean that we cannot honestly read the name as though it arrived without a past. El had a religious identity before Israelite monotheism reached its mature form. Elyon, meaning Most High, also appears in ancient West Semitic religious language. Scholars debate whether Elyon was originally an epithet of El, an independent divine figure in some traditions, or a title used flexibly across different contexts. What matters here is that the expression belongs to a world in which divine names and titles were not yet arranged according to the later theological categories imposed upon them. Melchizedek is therefore not introduced as a priest using language unique to Israel. His title places him naturally within the religious vocabulary of pre-Israelite Canaan. This creates a difficulty. The later biblical narrative frequently portrays Canaanite religion as corrupt, forbidden, and incompatible with loyalty to Yahweh. Israel is warned not to imitate surrounding peoples. Their altars are condemned. Their sacred poles are destroyed. Their deities are treated as rivals or false gods. Yet, in Genesis 14, Abram receives a blessing from a priest whose divine title comes from that older religious landscape. No conflict is described. No rebuke occurs. No conversion scene follows. Abram does not behave as though he has encountered an enemy of his God. Perhaps this is because the religious boundaries were not yet what later writers wanted them to appear to have been. Religious traditions rarely emerge fully formed. They grow through contact, conflict, borrowing, reinterpretation, and consolidation. The identity of Yahweh, The language of El, the symbolism of divine councils, and the worship practices of early Israel developed over time. Later, monotheism may have looked backward and projected its completed form into an earlier age. Spinoza repeatedly warned against this habit. Readers assume that ancient writers possessed the theological system constructed by later generations. They then force earlier texts to speak a language those texts had not yet learned. The result is an illusion of perfect continuity. A religion presents itself as though its doctrines descended unchanged from the beginning. Contradictions become mysteries. Older divine names become harmless titles. Rival traditions become imperfect glimpses of one final truth. Historical development is replaced by the appearance of eternal uniformity. But the biblical record retains traces of a more complicated past. One of the most important traces appears in Deuteronomy 32. An ancient poetic passage describes the Most High dividing the nations and assigning peoples according to the number of divine beings. Yahweh receives Jacob as his allotted people. In older manuscript traditions, including evidence preserved among the Dead Sea Scrolls, the wording refers to sons of God or divine beings. The Greek Septuagint also reflects a celestial distribution. A later Hebrew form reads sons of Israel, a phrase that softens the polytheistic or council-like imagery. Read in its older form, the passage appears to distinguish between the Most High who distributes the nations and Yahweh who receives Israel. This does not prove that every Israelite writer always regarded Elyon and Yahweh as entirely separate gods. Ancient religious identities were not governed by modern definitions. One community could identify two divine names. Another might preserve distinctions. A later editor might combine traditions that originated separately, but the passage does reveal development. The theological equation, El Elyon equals Yahweh, in every period and every text, cannot simply be assumed. It must be argued, and the evidence does not always cooperate. Imagine a river formed by several streams. Far downstream, the waters have mixed so completely that no observer can separate them by sight. A later community stands beside that river and declares that there was always only one stream. Yet if we travel upstream, we discover channels approaching from different directions. The later unity is real, but it does not erase the history of convergence. Something similar may have occurred in Israelite religion. Titles and characteristics associated with El were increasingly identified with Yahweh. The high god of the older Canaanite world and the national God of Israel became theologically united. As this process advanced, ancient stories could be reread as though the identification had always been obvious. Melchizedek's blessing then became easy to domesticate. El Elyon was translated as God Most High. Abram was assumed to be worshiping the same God as later Israel. The Canaanite background disappeared behind familiar vocabulary. What had once reflected a complex religious environment now sounded like a straightforward meeting between two servants of a single, universally understood deity. But the text itself preserves the older name, and names remember what institutions prefer to forget. This is why the question of Melchizedek's city matters. The text calls him King of Salem. Many readers have been taught to hear in Salem an atmosphere of peace, almost as though he ruled an ideal spiritual kingdom detached from ordinary history. Yet Salem was not an imagined sanctuary. It was Jerusalem, before Jerusalem became Israelite. That city had rulers, temples, political alliances, and religious traditions centuries before David conquered it. Melchizedek does not float outside history. He belongs to a particular place. And once we identify that place, the cultural identity of the priest becomes even more difficult to avoid. Salem is widely identified with Jerusalem. Biblical poetry places Salem in parallel with Zion, and ancient Jewish historians made the connection explicitly. The identification is not a modern attempt to undermine the text. It is the traditional and scholarly reading. But Jerusalem, in the imagined age of Abram, was not the capital of Israel. Israel did not yet exist as a kingdom. The city was controlled by Canaanite peoples, later remembered specifically as Jebusites. For centuries before David captured it, Jerusalem belonged to a political and religious world outside Israel. This matters because places shape institutions. A king does not reign over an abstract name. He rules a population, participates in local customs, uses inherited titles, and depends upon established networks of religious legitimacy. A priest king of early Jerusalem would naturally belong to the city's pre-Israelite sacred order. Archaeological and textual evidence confirms that Jerusalem existed as a Canaanite city long before its conquest by David. The Amarna correspondence, written during the 14th century BCE, includes letters from a ruler of Jerusalem named Abdi-Heba. He appeals to the Egyptian pharaoh for assistance against regional enemies. His city appears as part of the political network of Canaan. These letters do not identify Melchizedek. They come from a different period, but they demonstrate the continuity of a non-Israelite Jerusalem ruled by kings whose identities and loyalties emerged from the religious culture of the region. The biblical narratives themselves preserve this memory. Joshua confronts a king of Jerusalem named Adonizedek. Later, David seizes the city from the Jebusites. The tradition does not claim that Jerusalem was always Israelite. It openly acknowledges that Israel inherited a city already ancient, already sacred, and already occupied by another people. Now place the names beside one another. Melchizedek, Adonizedek. The second name can be understood as "My Lord is Zedek," or the Lord of Righteousness, depending on how its elements are interpreted. Melchizedek is commonly translated King of Righteousness. Scholars debate whether Zedek functioned as a divine name, a title, or a concept associated with the city's religious vocabulary. The debate itself is important because it prevents false certainty. We do not need to pretend that every detail has been settled. Reason does not demand that we replace one dogma with another. It asks us to distinguish what the evidence supports strongly from what remains possible. What the names clearly show is continuity in the royal language of pre-Israelite Jerusalem. Two kings associated with the same city bear names, built from the same religious element. This is not random noise. It suggests a local tradition linking kingship, justice, and sacred authority. Melchizedek therefore fits his environment remarkably well. He rules a Canaanite city. He carries a name consistent with that city's older royal vocabulary. He serves Elyon, a divine title rooted in the West Semitic world. He performs a priestly ritual involving blessing, bread, wine, and tribute. Nothing in the earliest description requires him to be a supernatural being. Nothing identifies him as an Israelite. Nothing says he anticipated Christianity consciously. He appears as an ancient priest-king, whom Abram recognizes and honors. Yet later traditions could not leave him there. The figure was too useful. Because so little was recorded about him, he became available for reinterpretation. His silence made him flexible. Communities could project upon him whatever their theological systems required. This is one of the paradoxes of interpretation. The less a text says about a figure, the more freedom later readers possess to expand him. A well-documented character resists transformation because details limit invention. An obscure character has no such defenses. Melchizedek became a blank surface. Jewish interpreters imagined him in different ways. Some identified him with Shem, the son of Noah, thereby giving him a place within a known genealogy. Others elevated him into a heavenly or angelic figure. Christian writers eventually transformed him into the model of an eternal priesthood fulfilled in Christ. Each interpretation answered a later need, but the needs of interpreters are not the same as the intentions of the original text. Spinoza's method requires us to examine not only what an interpretation claims, but why it arose. What problem was it designed to solve? What institution benefited from it? What contradiction did it make manageable? The Christian use of Melchizedek was shaped by a serious theological difficulty. The early movement proclaimed Jesus as Messiah, mediator, sacrificial offering, and heavenly high priest. Yet according to the genealogical traditions preserved in the Gospels, Jesus belonged to the tribe of Judah and the house of David. Israel's hereditary priesthood belonged to Levi, specifically to the descendants of Aaron. This was not a minor administrative rule. The Torah repeatedly defines priestly eligibility through lineage. Priests possess duties, clothing, restrictions, ritual roles, and inherited authority. A person does not become an Aaronic priest through spiritual insight or moral excellence. He is born into the proper family. Jesus, being associated with Judah, did not qualify. If the Christian claim were measured only against the Levitical system, calling Jesus a high priest would appear legally incoherent. The emerging movement, therefore, required another model of priesthood, one more ancient than Levi, independent of Aaron, and capable of being applied to a Davidic Messiah. Melchizedek offered the solution. He appeared before Moses. He appeared before the law. He was both king and priest. Abram honored him. And because his ancestry was unknown, his priesthood seemed free from hereditary limitation. The anonymous author of the letter to the Hebrews recognized the opportunity. He drew together Genesis 14 and a line from Psalm 110, declaring that a royal figure was a priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek. That combination would transform 3 obscure verses into one of the central foundations of Christian theology. But first, the author had to perform an interpretive act of extraordinary boldness. He had to turn missing information into eternal reality. The authorship of Hebrews remains unknown. Unlike the letters that identify Paul, Peter, James, or other named senders, Hebrews begins without a personal introduction. Its language is polished, its argument carefully designed, and its knowledge of Jewish scripture extensive. For centuries, Christian communities debated who wrote it. Paul was frequently proposed, but differences in vocabulary, style, and theological method made the attribution uncertain even in antiquity. Origen famously concluded that the truth of its authorship was known only to God. This anonymity does not invalidate the document. Arguments are not false merely because their authors are uncertain. But anonymity matters when a text establishes authority that later institutions treat as eternal. We are dealing with an unknown writer addressing an uncertain audience at a decisive period in the formation of Christianity. That writer faced a structural problem. Jesus was being proclaimed as the ultimate high priest, yet he did not belong to the priestly tribe. The law gave no ordinary route around this obstacle. A new category had to be constructed without appearing new. Psalm 110 supplied the necessary bridge. The psalm addresses a royal figure and speaks of permanent priesthood in relation to Melchizedek. In its original historical setting, it may have functioned as a coronation hymn, affirming the sacred status of an Israelite king. By the 1st century, however, some interpreters read it messianically. Hebrews applies the psalm to Jesus. This allows the author to argue that Jesus belongs to a priestly order older and greater than Aaron's. The logic depends upon Abram's encounter with Melchizedek. Abram gives Melchizedek a tenth and receives his blessing. Levi and Aaron are later descendants of Abram. Therefore, Hebrews reasons symbolically, the Levitical priesthood was already subordinate to Melchizedek through its ancestor. The argument is ingenious, but ingenuity should not be confused with historical description. Hebrews then describes Melchizedek as without father, without mother, without genealogy, possessing neither beginning of days nor end of life, and remaining a priest continually. Genesis says none of this directly. Genesis does not claim that Melchizedek was literally parentless. It merely does not name his parents. Genesis does not claim that he never died. It simply does not narrate his death. Genesis does not claim that he existed eternally. It gives no account of his birth or final years. The author of Hebrews transforms textual omission into ontological condition. What is absent from the story becomes absent from the man's existence. No genealogy on the page becomes no genealogy in reality. No death scene becomes an unending priesthood. This is the decisive move. Imagine discovering a damaged biography in which the first pages and final chapter have been lost. Would it be rational to conclude that the subject was never born and never died? Of course not. The absence belongs to the document, not necessarily to the person described by it. Hebrews collapses that distinction for theological purpose. Defenders may answer that the author is using typology rather than writing literal biography. Melchizedek resembles the Son of God because the literary presentation makes him appear without ancestry or death. In this reading, the silence of Genesis functions symbolically rather than historically. That interpretation is more careful, yet it still confirms the central point. Hebrews is not recovering forgotten facts about the historical Melchizedek. It is creating theological meaning from the form of the earlier narrative. The author does not possess additional biographical evidence. He interprets the pattern of what Genesis includes and omits. Spinoza would ask us to keep these levels separate. What does Genesis say? What does Hebrews infer? What does later Christianity build upon that inference? Once these questions are merged, interpretation disguises itself as revelation. A theological construction begins to appear as though it were already present in the original text, waiting unchanged for centuries until someone finally pointed to it. But the construction becomes visible when we restore the chronological order. First comes a short narrative about a priest-king of Salem. Later comes a royal psalm invoking Melchizedek. Still later comes an anonymous Christian writer combining the two in order to explain Jesus' priesthood. Later still come doctrines, liturgies, councils, sacramental systems, and institutional claims built upon that Christian interpretation. Each stage depends on the previous one, but each also transforms it. This is how traditions grow. They do not merely preserve texts. They produce new meanings by placing texts beside other texts, asking new questions, and solving new problems. There is nothing inherently dishonest about reinterpretation. Human beings cannot read without bringing concerns, language, and historical circumstances to what they read. Dishonesty begins when interpretation denies that it is interpretation. The problem is not that Hebrews develops Genesis. The problem arises when later authorities teach the development as though Genesis itself plainly declared an eternal, supernatural priest, untouched by birth and death. It did not. Recognizing this distinction does not require hostility toward believers. It requires intellectual discipline. A person may value a symbolic interpretation while still admitting that it is symbolic. One may find meaning in typology without pretending that typology is biography. Freedom begins when we stop demanding that a text say more than it says. Why, then, did Melchizedek become more than a symbol of ancient kingship? Why was he already being imagined as a heavenly judge before Christianity fully emerged? The answer lay hidden for centuries in caves near the Dead Sea. When manuscripts from Qumran were discovered, they revealed a Jewish world far more diverse than many later religious histories had allowed. Among those fragments was a text now known as 11Q Melchizedek. It showed that Hebrews did not create the celestial Melchizedek from nothing. Another Jewish community had already raised him from the roads of Canaan into the heavens, and they did so before the birth of Christianity. The manuscript known as 11Q Melchizedek survives only in fragments. It was found among the Dead Sea Scrolls and is generally dated to the period before or around the beginning of the Common Era. Its damaged condition demands caution. We do not possess the complete work, and reconstruction inevitably involves scholarly judgment. Yet what remains is remarkable. In this text, Melchizedek is no longer merely a human king who once met Abram. He appears as an exalted heavenly agent involved in final judgment, liberation, atonement, and the defeat of evil. The document draws upon biblical passages concerning Jubilee, release from debt, freedom for captives, divine judgment, and the triumph of righteousness. It places these themes within an apocalyptic framework in which history moves toward a decisive moment. Melchizedek stands at the center of that moment. The text applies elevated divine language to him, including the term Elohim in a context suggesting a heavenly ruler or judge. It associates him with the divine assembly of Psalm 82. He announces release, executes judgment, and opposes Belial, the figure representing the forces of darkness. The precise status assigned to Melchizedek remains debated. Was he understood as an archangel, a heavenly priest, a divine vice-regent, an exalted eschatological being? Scholars use different categories because ancient Jewish texts did not always maintain the boundaries. Later theology would impose between God, angels, messianic figures, and personified divine functions. But no reasonable reading reduces him to an ordinary earthly king. The Qumran community had transformed Melchizedek into a cosmic figure. This transformation occurred before Hebrews developed its Christian argument. It may even have emerged before the life of Jesus. Therefore, the author of Hebrews operated within a religious environment where Melchizedek had already accumulated meanings far beyond Genesis 14. That changes the historical picture. The Christian claim did not appear in an empty intellectual landscape. Ideas of heavenly mediators, exalted patriarchs, angelic rulers, divine agents, final judgment, spiritual warfare, and cosmic priesthood circulated in several Jewish communities. Christianity inherited this world and rearranged its symbols around Jesus. This does not prove simple copying. Intellectual history is rarely so mechanical. The author of Hebrews may never have read the exact Qumran manuscript. Two groups can develop related interpretations from shared scriptures and common traditions. Melchizedek's textual obscurity invited expansion, and Psalm 110 supplied a powerful line connecting him to permanent priesthood. Still, the chronological fact remains significant. A heavenly, redemptive Melchizedek was imaginable within Judaism before Christianity established Jesus as the eternal priest of Melchizedek's order. The concept was not created after the resurrection accounts as a wholly unprecedented revelation. It had a prehistory. Religious institutions often defend uniqueness because uniqueness strengthens authority. If a doctrine is presented as appearing suddenly from heaven, it seems beyond historical explanation. If its components can be traced through earlier traditions, the doctrine begins to look like a human development. But development does not automatically mean falsehood. This is where a rational inquiry must resist simplistic conclusions in both directions. To show that an idea has antecedents does not disprove every spiritual meaning later attached to it. Music can be created from inherited notes. Languages produce new poems using old words. A philosophy may transform concepts it did not invent. The relevant question is not whether Christianity used earlier materials. All traditions use earlier materials. The relevant question is whether believers were allowed to know that it did. When theology presents inherited symbols as entirely unprecedented, history becomes a threat. Archaeology must be hidden behind specialist language. Difficult manuscript evidence remains inside universities. Clergy learn complexity during training but communicate certainty to congregations. This division creates two religions. One is taught in seminaries. It knows that biblical texts have layers, competing manuscript traditions, anonymous authors, editorial development, and influences from surrounding cultures. The other is taught from pulpits. It speaks as though every doctrine were equally clear, every biblical voice perfectly harmonious, and every later institution directly visible in the earliest text. The first religion survives through qualification. The second survives through confidence. Melchizedek stands between them. In the academic world, he is a complex figure shaped by Canaanite religion, Israelite royal ideology, Second Temple Jewish speculation, Christian interpretation, and later sacramental theology. In popular teaching, he becomes a mysterious servant of the one God who brought bread and wine to Abraham and prophetically foreshadowed Jesus. The simplified version is not entirely fabricated. It is assembled from real elements, but it conceals the development connecting them. Consider the chain carefully. Genesis introduces a priest-king of Salem serving Elyon. Psalm 110 connects a royal figure with a lasting priesthood associated with Melchizedek. Jewish apocalyptic tradition elevates Melchizedek into a heavenly liberator and judge. Hebrews uses his literary absence of genealogy and death to explain a priesthood superior to Levi. Christian theology identifies Jesus with that permanent priestly pattern. Later liturgy links Melchizedek's bread and wine to the Eucharistic offering. Each link changes the meaning of the one before it. By the time Melchizedek reaches the Christian altar, almost nothing remains of the ancient Canaanite king, except his name, his priestly title, and the objects he carried. Yet those surviving elements are enough to authorize an entire sacramental system. This is why the story cannot end in the Qumran caves. The most consequential transformation occurs when interpretation becomes institution. A speculative reading can remain one possibility among many, but once a church embeds that reading into ordination, liturgy, sacrifice, and claims of authority, the interpretation gains material power. It shapes buildings. It creates offices. It determines who may speak for God. It defines who may administer sacred rites. It enters the bodies of believers through ritual. Melchizedek becomes more than an ancient puzzle. He becomes part of the architecture of Christian priesthood. And nowhere is that architecture more visible than in the Catholic Mass, where his name has been spoken over bread and wine for century after century. To understand the weight of that invocation, we must follow the construction from Hebrews into doctrine, and from doctrine to the altar. Catholic theology does not treat the priesthood of Christ as a minor metaphor. It stands near the center of the sacramental system. The ordained priest acts in the person of Christ within the liturgy. The Eucharistic celebration is understood not merely as a dramatic recollection of the crucifixion, but as a sacramental participation in Christ's one sacrifice. The priest's authority is traced through apostolic succession, while Christ's own priesthood is explained through the letter to the Hebrews. Christ is a priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek. That phrase resolves the tribal difficulty that once confronted the anonymous Christian author. Jesus does not need to descend from Aaron, because his priesthood belongs to an earlier and superior order. Later, Catholic doctrine formalized the connection. The Council of Trent, responding to the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century, defended the sacrificial character of the Mass and affirmed Christ's permanent priesthood. It connected the offering of bread and wine with the figure of Melchizedek and with Christ's institution of the Eucharist. What began as a brief encounter in Genesis had now become binding theology. The chain appears seamless when read backward from the altar. Bread and wine are present in the Mass. Jesus gives bread and wine to his disciples. Melchizedek brings bread and wine to Abram. Therefore, Melchizedek prefigures Christ and the Eucharist. But historical reasoning must move forward, not backward. When later meanings are projected into earlier objects, familiarity creates the illusion of destiny. Bread and wine are widespread elements of ancient life and ritual. Their presence in Genesis does not by itself establish a conscious prophecy of Christian sacrament. The connection is theological, not historically self-evident. That does not make it meaningless. Symbols acquire power through repetition and association. Yet the distinction must remain visible. A ritual resemblance can inspire typology without proving original intention. The Roman canon makes the relationship explicit. Within this ancient Eucharistic prayer, the priest asks God to receive the Church's offering as God received the offerings of Abel, Abraham, and Melchizedek. Three figures are joined across different biblical stories. Their offerings become patterns through which the present sacrifice is interpreted. When Melchizedek is named, the prayer refers to him as a high priest. For most worshippers, the name passes quickly. The ritual continues. Bells may sound. The priest's hands move over the altar. The congregation hears words absorbed through years of repetition. Repetition produces familiarity, and familiarity can feel like knowledge. But what does the average person in the pew actually know about the man being invoked? Do they know that his city was pre-Israelite Jerusalem? Do they know that Elyon belongs to the older West Semitic religious world? Do they know that Genesis does not call him eternal? Do they know that Hebrews develops its argument from what Genesis leaves unrecorded? Do they know that Jewish writings before Christianity could portray Melchizedek as a heavenly redeemer and judge? Most do not. The name functions liturgically even when its history remains unknown. This creates an uncomfortable division between ritual participation and informed consent. A believer may sincerely enter a sacred action while possessing only a simplified account of the symbols supporting it. Again, this does not mean that every priest is consciously deceiving his congregation. Institutions are more complicated than individual intention. A priest may study historical criticism and still believe that divine providence works through textual development. He may know that Genesis reflects ancient Canaanite language and nevertheless accept the Christian typology of Melchizedek. He may distinguish historical origin from theological fulfillment and see no contradiction between them. The problem is not solved by accusing every clergyman of fraud. The deeper problem is structural. Why is complexity treated as safe for specialists, but dangerous for ordinary believers? Why are textual uncertainties discussed in classrooms, yet replaced by certainty in sermons? Why does an institution trust seminarians with ambiguity but assume congregations require simplicity? Perhaps leaders fear that faith will collapse if believers see how doctrines developed. Perhaps they believe pastoral care requires clarity rather than endless qualification. Perhaps many clergy themselves received the simplified version and never examined the academic questions deeply. Whatever the cause, the effect remains. The public tradition conceals the mechanisms by which the tradition was built. Spinoza regarded this concealment as a source of intellectual bondage. When people are taught to revere words without understanding their history, those who interpret the words gain power. The sacred text becomes a sealed object. Authority belongs to those who claim the right to explain it. The believer learns obedience before investigation and fear before comprehension. The strongest institutions do not merely tell people what to believe. They shape which questions feel permissible. A Catholic child may hear Melchizedek's name hundreds of times without ever thinking to ask who he was. The ritual places the name in an atmosphere of holiness so complete that curiosity can feel almost disrespectful. But a question is not an act of desecration. To ask what a symbol means is to take it seriously. Imagine the priest standing at the altar. Bread rests before him. Wine fills the chalice. He invokes Abel, Abraham, and Melchizedek. Behind the gesture stands a chain stretching across millennia. Canaanite kingship, Israelite scripture, Jewish apocalyptic imagination, anonymous Christian exegesis, patristic interpretation, medieval liturgy, conciliar doctrine, and modern sacramental practice. That history is more complicated than the sermon usually suggests. It is also more human. The tradition did not descend as a finished monument. It was assembled generation by generation. Each age inherited materials, rearranged them, defended them, and passed them onward. Once we see this, the question changes. We are no longer asking whether Melchizedek was secretly Jesus, an angel, an immortal priest, or a forgotten Canaanite king. We are asking how human beings transform fragments into systems, and why those systems eventually present themselves as though no transformation ever occurred. That question does not concern only ancient religion. It concerns every inherited belief that governs a life without ever being examined. Perhaps you recognize the feeling. You sit inside a ritual, listen to a doctrine, or repeat a phrase you have heard since childhood. Everyone around you appears certain. The words are spoken with confidence. The gestures are ancient. The building itself seems to testify that what is happening must be true. Yet somewhere beneath the familiarity, a question remains. Something does not fit. You may have been taught that this discomfort was temptation, pride, rebellion, or weakness of faith. You may have learned to distrust your own intelligence whenever it came into conflict with inherited authority. But doubt is not always the enemy of truth. Sometimes doubt is the mind recognizing that an explanation has concealed its own construction. This does not mean every suspicion is correct. Human beings can doubt irrationally just as they can believe irrationally. Spinoza did not replace obedience with impulsive rejection. He replaced both with understanding. Understanding asks for causes. How did this doctrine arise? Which texts support it? Which conclusions were inferred rather than stated? What historical problem did the interpretation solve? How did a possibility become an obligation? Who gains authority when this interpretation is accepted? These questions do not destroy meaning. They separate meaning from compulsion. Melchizedek demonstrates how easily people confuse the history of a text with the history of its interpretation. Genesis gives us a brief encounter. Later readers give us an eternal priest. The distance between those two figures is filled by centuries of intellectual labor, religious conflict, symbolic imagination, and institutional necessity. Once that distance becomes visible, no authority can honestly claim that the later doctrine simply lay on the surface from the beginning. The silence concerning Melchizedek's parents is not proof that he had none. The silence concerning his death is not proof that he escaped mortality. The ancient title Elyon cannot be stripped of its Canaanite environment, merely because later theology identifies it with Yahweh. The bread and wine do not explain themselves. The order of Melchizedek is not a documented institution described in Genesis. It is a theological category developed through later interpretation. These observations do not force one final conclusion upon every listener. A Christian may continue to regard Melchizedek as a providential symbol of Christ. A Catholic may continue to participate in the Mass while acknowledging the historical layers beneath its language. A skeptic may see the entire construction as evidence that priestly authority rests on reinterpretation rather than revelation. The purpose of understanding is not to replace one compulsory answer with another. It is to remove the fear that prevents honest examination. Freedom, in Spinoza's sense, is not the ability to exist without causes. Nothing exists outside causality. Our beliefs arise from families, communities, language, education, fear, desire, memory, and social pressure. We become freer when we understand these causes, instead of being moved by them blindly. A person who repeats a doctrine because questioning it produces terror is not acting freely. A person who rejects religion merely because of anger may not be free either. Both can remain governed by affects they do not understand. Greater freedom appears when the mind sees the chain clearly. You inherited a story about Melchizedek. That story may have arrived through a priest, a pastor, a parent, a catechism, a study Bible, or a sermon. It may have presented him as a mysterious servant of the true God, a timeless priest, or a direct foreshadowing of Jesus. Now the chain behind that story is visible. A priest-king from pre-Israelite Jerusalem serves Elyon and blesses Abram. A royal psalm invokes a Melchizedek-like priesthood. Jewish communities expand the figure into the heavenly realm. An anonymous Christian author uses him to resolve the conflict between Jesus' Judahite lineage and the Levitical requirements of priesthood. Later churches establish sacramental and institutional authority through that interpretation. The Mass carries the name into the present. None of this was entirely hidden. The evidence remained in manuscripts, lexicons, archaeological reports, commentaries, footnotes, and seminaries. The problem was not that knowledge disappeared. The problem was that knowledge was distributed unequally. The congregation received certainty. The specialist received complexity. And when complexity is confined to libraries, while certainty governs the pulpit, silence becomes a form of power. This is the final lesson Melchizedek offers. The most influential religious constructions are not always built from explicit statements. Sometimes they rise from gaps, missing genealogies, unexplained names, absent conclusions, and ambiguous symbols. An empty space is offered to imagination. Imagination becomes interpretation. Interpretation becomes doctrine. Doctrine becomes ritual. Ritual becomes authority. Authority then points backward and claims that the entire structure was present in the empty space from the beginning. But what was built is not the same as what was found. Recognizing that difference may feel like loss. The old story was simpler. It placed every figure inside one continuous divine plan. It removed uncertainty and made history appear perfectly ordered. Yet the collapse of simplicity can open a deeper kind of peace. You no longer need to force ancient writers to possess modern theology. You no longer need to treat every contradiction as a test of loyalty. You no longer need to defend silence as though silence were evidence. You can allow the past to be complex. You can allow traditions to develop. You can recognize that people create meaning without pretending that every created meaning arrived untouched from eternity. The question is not merely who Melchizedek was. The harder question is what happens inside you when an inherited symbol loses the protection of mystery. Do you rush to defend it because your identity depends upon it? Do you reject it immediately because anger feels more powerful than uncertainty? Or can you remain still long enough to understand how the symbol was formed, why it endured, and what emotional need it continues to satisfy? Perhaps the most important discovery is not that Melchizedek belonged to a forgotten religious world. Perhaps it is that your mind does not have to remain imprisoned inside the interpretations you inherited. You may examine them. You may trace their causes. You may distinguish text from commentary, history from theology, and evidence from assumption. And then you may decide consciously what meaning, if any, you wish to preserve. Which part of this history changes your understanding most deeply? Is it the identity of Elyon, the pre-Israelite character of Salem, the way Hebrews turns narrative silence into eternal priesthood, the heavenly Melchizedek found in pre-Christian Jewish tradition, or the continued invocation of his name within Christian worship? Share the point that challenged you most, not to win an argument, but to make the hidden process of interpretation visible. Because you entered this inquiry carrying a familiar story, you leave it facing the evidence from which that story was constructed. And between a story inherited without examination and a document finally examined with reason lies the beginning of intellectual freedom. But intellectual freedom is not completed by exposure alone. To discover that a tradition was constructed does not immediately tell you what to do with it. A person can learn how a doctrine developed and still feel emotionally bound to it. Knowledge reaches the mind first. Identity, memory, loyalty, and fear often remain behind. This is why the story of Melchizedek cannot be reduced to a debate over ancient names or manuscript variants. The argument reaches into something more personal, the relationship between truth and belonging. For many people, the Mass was never merely a theological claim. It was childhood. It was the smell of incense, the silence before the altar, the voice of a parent whispering prayers, the hands of a grandmother folded in devotion. It was funerals, weddings, first communions, holidays, and ordinary Sundays. To examine the historical foundation beneath the ritual can therefore feel like examining the foundation beneath one's own family. The emotions are real, even when the interpretation is questioned. A person may discover that Melchizedek was most likely connected to pre-Israelite Jerusalem and still remember a priest who treated the suffering with kindness. Someone may reject the theological construction of Hebrews while remaining grateful for a community that offered food, companionship, or comfort. Historical criticism does not erase human experience, and this distinction matters. The people who trusted the tradition were not necessarily foolish. Most inherited a religious system long before they possessed the language or freedom to investigate it. They received its conclusions from people they loved. Those people had received the same conclusions from others. Tradition moves through affection as much as through argument. A child rarely accepts a doctrine because they have compared manuscript evidence. They accept it because a trusted adult speaks with certainty. The belief enters the mind together with safety, family, and approval. Later, to question the belief may feel like betraying the people attached to it. That is why institutions do not survive by doctrine alone. They survive by joining doctrine to identity. Spinoza understood the power of this attachment. Human beings are not governed only by reason. They are moved by hope, fear, gratitude, resentment, loyalty, and the desire to belong. An institution that controls the meaning of these emotions can exercise greater authority than one that merely commands outward obedience. Fear is especially powerful. A person may be told that doubt threatens the soul, that investigation opens the door to deception, or that questioning sacred authority reveals pride. Under these conditions, uncertainty becomes dangerous before the evidence is even considered. The mind learns to retreat from its own questions. But a fear-based refusal to examine evidence is not faith. It is emotional dependence. To understand why this dependence persists, imagine a structure standing for so long that no living person remembers its construction. Every generation is born inside it. The walls appear natural. The rooms receive sacred names. The people who maintain the building may sincerely believe that it could never have been arranged differently. Most priests did not design the system they inherited. Many of them may genuinely believe that the order of Melchizedek reveals a divine continuity from Genesis to Christ and from Christ to the Catholic priesthood. They may know that scholars debate the Canaanite background and still regard the later theological interpretation as inspired. The problem is larger than personal dishonesty. The problem is the division between what an institution knows in its advanced scholarship and what it considers safe to explain publicly. A seminarian may encounter the Ugaritic texts, the older reading of Deuteronomy 32, the unknown authorship of Hebrews, the interpretive nature of Hebrews 7, and the heavenly Melchizedek of Qumran. He may read scholars who carefully distinguish the historical priest-king from the theological figure constructed around him. Then he may enter a parish where none of that complexity is discussed. The congregation receives a straight line. Melchizedek served the true God. His bread and wine anticipated the Eucharist. His eternal priesthood foreshadowed Christ. The Catholic priesthood participates in that same order. Everything appears unified from the beginning. What disappears is the history of how the line was drawn. An institution may defend this simplification as pastoral necessity. People, it may claim, do not need technical debates. They need worship, stability, and a coherent faith. But there is a moral difference between simplifying information and concealing information that could change how a person evaluates a claim. A teacher may simplify astronomy for a child without deceiving them, but if the teacher knowingly presents an unresolved interpretation as unquestionable fact, simplification becomes control. The question is not whether every worshiper needs a graduate seminar on ancient Semitic religion. The question is whether worshippers are allowed to know that the doctrine being presented as plain biblical truth depends upon centuries of interpretation. Melchizedek exposes this difference with unusual force. Because the original material is so small, 3 verses become the foundation of an eternal priesthood. A missing genealogy becomes freedom from genealogy. An unrecorded death becomes endless life. A Canaanite divine title becomes a familiar name for the God of later Israel. Bread and wine become a sacramental prophecy. A pre-Christian heavenly Redeemer becomes part of the conceptual environment in which Christ is proclaimed as the final priest. The structure is vast. The textual foundation is narrow. And this imbalance is precisely why the gaps matter so much. When explicit evidence is limited, authority depends increasingly upon interpretation. The interpreter must persuade the audience that the conclusion was found rather than created. This is where Spinoza's method cuts through the construction. He would not begin by asking whether the doctrine is emotionally comforting or institutionally useful. He would ask what the text meant within its own language, period, and historical situation. He would separate Moses from later commentators, prophets from theologians, the original narrative from the doctrines built around it. He would refuse to assume that every biblical author shared one perfectly unified philosophical system. Most importantly, he would not permit absence to function as proof. What a text fails to record may provoke curiosity. It may encourage speculation. It may even become symbolically meaningful within a later community. But it cannot establish a historical fact by itself. The missing ancestry of Melchizedek tells us that the narrative does not provide his ancestry. Nothing more follows necessarily. The missing account of his death tells us that the narrative does not describe his death. It does not make him immortal. The distinction seems obvious once stated, yet entire systems of interpretation depend upon crossing it without allowing the audience to notice. And when the crossing is hidden, the resulting doctrine gains an authority it has not earned through evidence. This is why the original silence remains so important. Not because silence proves that an editor erased a particular biography. The surviving text alone cannot tell us exactly why the information is absent. The silence matters because later interpreters claim to know what it meant. They transformed uncertainty into certainty. They turned the absence into a theological resource. They built permanence upon omission. Once you understand the move, you begin to recognize it elsewhere. Whenever an authority tells you that a text's silence confirms a doctrine, ask whether the silence could support several different conclusions. Whenever an institution claims an ancient foundation, ask whether that foundation was explicit in the earliest source or produced by later interpretation. Whenever a religious leader presents a developed tradition as though it descended unchanged from the beginning, ask what historical steps have been removed from the story. These questions do not force you to abandon every tradition. They force the tradition to reveal its construction. And any belief that cannot survive an honest account of its own history deserves to be examined even more carefully. Yet one final image remains. It is the image that connects the ancient road, the anonymous Christian writer, the desert manuscripts, the Catholic council, and the modern altar. Bread, wine, two ordinary elements carrying an extraordinary weight of interpretation. To understand the final meaning of the story, we must return to them one last time. Picture the original scene again. A king priest comes out from Salem. He carries bread and wine. He invokes Elyon. Abram receives his blessing and gives him a tenth. The encounter is brief. Nothing in Genesis explains what Melchizedek believed about the future. Nothing tells us that he understood his act as a prophecy of Jesus. Nothing says that he belonged to an eternal order extending through Christian bishops and priests. Those meanings arrive later. Yet after centuries of repetition, the later meanings become so familiar that they seem to belong naturally to the original moment. This is the power of ritual memory. A symbol repeated inside an institution gradually loses the marks of its historical development. Bread and wine cease to appear as ancient objects used across many cultures. They become Christian objects. Melchizedek ceases to appear as a priest-king of a pre-Israelite city. He becomes a Christian precursor. The past is reorganized around the present. Every Sunday, when the Roman canon names Melchizedek, the liturgy compresses thousands of years into a single prayer. Abel, Abraham, Melchizedek, Christ, the priest, the altar, and the congregation are drawn into one sacred sequence. From within the ritual, the sequence feels eternal. From the perspective of history, it is a chain of interpretations. These perspectives are not identical. The priest at the altar may believe that the liturgy reveals a divine unity hidden beneath historical change. The historian may see communities repeatedly reworking inherited symbols to meet new theological needs. The believer may call this providence. The critic may call it construction, but neither label should prevent us from observing the process itself. The earliest text gave later interpreters only a few elements: a name, a city, a divine title, a blessing, bread, wine, and a tenth. Everything else had to be developed. The development did not happen in one moment. First, the priest-king became associated with the sacred identity of Jerusalem. Then a psalm linked his name to lasting royal priesthood. Jewish interpreters filled the silence surrounding his life with genealogical or heavenly explanations. A community near the Dead Sea imagined him as an agent of final liberation and judgment. The author of Hebrews transformed his absent genealogy into a theological likeness to the Son of God. Christian teachers then used that interpretation to explain how Jesus could be a priest without belonging to Levi. The Church joined the bread and wine of Genesis to the Eucharist. Councils formalized the doctrine. Priests repeated the connection in liturgy. Generations of worshippers inherited the finished structure without seeing the stages through which it had been built. This does not resemble a secret hidden in one locked room. It resembles a blueprint distributed across many specialized rooms, each open only to those trained to enter. The linguistic evidence sits in lexicons. The Canaanite background appears in archaeological studies. The manuscript variants appear in critical editions. The Qumran material appears in scholarly journals. The interpretive character of Hebrews appears in technical commentaries and footnotes. The Catholic doctrine appears in councils, catechisms, and liturgical texts. No single piece is entirely inaccessible. But the ordinary worshiper is rarely shown how the pieces fit together. That is the silence at the center of the story. Not merely the silence of Genesis regarding Melchizedek's parents. The larger silence is the gap between institutional knowledge and public teaching. A person in the pew hears the conclusion. The evidence and its complications remain elsewhere. The original transcript returns repeatedly to the claim that people in authority knew more than they explained. Whether every individual priest consciously understands every historical problem cannot be established from the text, but the broader contrast it describes is clear. Academic biblical study openly discusses complexities that popular religious teaching often avoids. And perhaps this avoidance continues because the consequences are difficult to control. Once a person learns that doctrine develops historically, they may begin asking similar questions elsewhere. Who decided which interpretation became official? Why did one manuscript reading survive while another faded? How did political authority influence theological uniformity? Which beliefs were condemned because they lacked evidence, and which were protected despite depending on interpretation? Why are believers taught that questioning an institution is dangerous when the institution itself was formed through centuries of argument? The problem is no longer Melchizedek alone. Melchizedek becomes a case study in the manufacture of sacred certainty. A small textual opening becomes a doorway. An interpreter passes through it. A later community builds a corridor. An institution constructs a temple around the corridor. Eventually, people are told that the temple was always present inside the doorway. Spinoza's response would be severe but liberating. Return to the text, investigate its language, examine its history, identify the causes behind the interpretation, and refuse to confuse authority with evidence. This method does not promise emotional comfort. Understanding may remove certainties that once provided stability. It may expose contradictions that cannot be harmonized without force. It may separate you from people who experience questions as threats. But the alternative is intellectual dependence. To defend a doctrine merely because it has been repeated is to surrender the mind to duration. Age does not transform assumption into fact. A belief may be ancient and mistaken. A ritual may be beautiful and historically constructed. A priest may be sincere and still repeat an interpretation unsupported by the earliest text. A community may offer genuine love while teaching conclusions that cannot withstand examination. Reality does not divide itself according to our emotional need for simple categories. This is why understanding must be more than accusation. If you leave the story only with anger toward priests, theologians, or believers, then the same emotional forces still govern you. You remain reactive. The object of devotion has changed into an object of hostility, but your freedom has not necessarily increased. The deeper task is to understand how the construction worked. Why was Melchizedek needed? Because Christianity proclaimed a priest from the tribe of Judah. Why was his genealogy important? Because its absence allowed him to stand outside Levitical descent. Why was Psalm 110 important? Because it supplied scriptural language for a permanent non-Aaronic priesthood. Why were bread and wine important? Because they allowed later Christians to connect Genesis with the Eucharist. Why was the heavenly Melchizedek tradition important? Because it shows that exalted priestly and redemptive interpretations were already circulating before Christianity fully formed its claims. Why does the liturgical invocation matter? Because it carries the entire interpretive structure into the repeated religious life of the present. Once the causes become visible, the mystery loses its power to compel blind submission. The symbol may remain meaningful, but it no longer controls you through ignorance. You can now decide whether to treat Melchizedek as a historical priest-king, a literary figure, a theological symbol, an example of interpretive expansion, or several of these at once. What you no longer need to do is pretend that Genesis plainly teaches everything later institutions claim to find there. The text does not. It gives us a man who appears, blesses, receives a tenth, and disappears. The eternity came from interpretation. The priestly order came from interpretation. The Christian fulfillment came from interpretation. The sacramental connection came from interpretation. The institutional authority came from interpretation repeated until it appeared indistinguishable from revelation. That is the central confrontation. A silence in an ancient document cannot carry the weight of certainty merely because generations have placed that weight upon it. A missing line is still a missing line. It does not become proof through ritual. It does not become history through doctrine. It does not become eternal because an authority says the word eternal over it. The final question is therefore not whether you can recover the complete biography of Melchizedek. The evidence may never allow that. The question is whether you are willing to distinguish what is known from what was constructed. Which part of the chain affected you most? Was it the realization that Elyon belongs to the ancient Canaanite religious landscape? Was it the identification of Salem with a Jerusalem that existed before Israelite control? Was it the method used by Hebrews, turning what Genesis omits into a model of endless priesthood? Was it the pre-Christian manuscript that portrays Melchizedek as a heavenly liberator and judge? Or was it the recognition that his name continues to be invoked over bread and wine before congregations rarely taught the history behind it? Place your answer in the comments, not as a weapon against another person, but as an honest record of what changed when the structure became visible. And consider sharing this investigation with someone who has carried the private suspicion that sacred words and historical evidence were not always aligned. Do not send it to humiliate them. Do not send it to strip away what they love. Send it because uncertainty becomes heavier when people are forced to carry it alone. You began with a sacred story repeated through generations. You now possess the fragments, the names, the manuscripts, the historical layers, and the interpretive steps from which that story was assembled. A received story and an examined record are not the same thing. And once you understand the difference, the silence can no longer command you as it once did.